Well, hello, my friend. Welcome back to another episode of the From Chaos to Peace podcast, where I talk about how clutter is so much more than you think, and we put a spiritual twist on clearing that clutter to get organized. Thank you so much for allowing me back into your ears. Well, hello, my friend. I'm Conny, Graf, your host. Welcome to the podcast. How are you today? Thank you so much for allowing me back into your ears. Today, I want to continue with my series where I want to bust some of the myths about decluttering and getting organized that I hear the gurus and the so-called experts shout from the rooftops. As I said in last episode, chances are you've heard a lot of advice out there like only touch something once, or everything must spark joy, or if you haven't used something in a year, it must go. But here's the thing, all this advice is really treated like sacred cows, when those are just old bulls producing a lot of bullshit. Yeah, I know, maybe not the most pretty picture for you, but I find it funny. Either way, so in this series, I break down, I think, 12 myths in the end. We'll see how many there will be. And I explain why I think it's nonsense, and I give you a better and hopefully more doable approach instead. So last week I covered or debunked the first myth, and that was episode 260, where I talked about that decluttering is not a one-time event, but rather a journey of mostly small, maybe sometimes a little bit bigger steps. And a journey of self-development, of course, and of constant tweaking and making sure it aligns with where you're headed and where you are in your life right now. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, episode 260, then after this episode, maybe you go back and listen to that one. That's really like the most fundamental myth that I wanted to bust. So that was last week, 260. But today, we move on to myth number 2. And that myth says a clutter-free home equals a clutter-free mind. And this one is a tricky one because, yes, I do say too, as within, so without. So the outside is a reflection of the inside. And so we might assume that a clutter-free home, so no chaos outside, would automatically mean that there is a clutter-free mind and instant inner peace. But unfortunately, that's not always true, or most of the time it's not true. A neat home, and neat is a weird word. It's like tidy. I don't like tidy. Neat is also kind of like, I don't know. Anyways, a neat or a clutter-free home doesn't automatically clear the inner chaos. The real mental and emotional decluttering requires actually inner work. So let's see how we can debunk this myth and what we can do instead. Because it sounds so logical, especially since Conny, me, also says as within, so without. So while when we're more peaceful on the inside, I think it is really true that then we're more likely have a more peaceful and clear outside. But also not necessarily, and for sure not the other way around. Even though it sounds logical. Less stuff, less stress, right? That is true. But while an organized space can be calming and supportive, and therefore definitely very helpful, it doesn't guarantee inner peace. You could live in the most minimalistic, Instagram and Pinterest worthy home and still feel overwhelmed, anxious, and stuck. Why? Because of the things that you are thinking. Now, the myth persists probably because many people associate external order with internal calm. And yes, decluttering can be a powerful tool to reduce stress. I always say this on the podcast. Clutter stresses us out, and if we declutter our physical environment, it does reduce stress. But it's actually only if we're also focusing on the inner decluttering, on the mental decluttering, and the emotional decluttering. Because if we're only focusing on the outside, on the physical and digital spaces, then we're just scratching the surface of what's possible. And we're also kind of fighting an uphill battle because our inner world is still chaotic, and our nasty gremlin, how I call it, will constantly give us negative thoughts, which creates a lot of turmoil and chaos on the inside, while you're really trying hard to keep the outside decluttered. Again, a decluttered outside or decluttering the outside will actually really help to calm down the chaos on the inside, but it still needs both sides, right? It's almost like the coin, every coin has two sides, and here this is the same. But what I noticed is that mental and emotional clutter is often a new concept for people. Many, and maybe you're one of them, don't realize that besides physical paper and digital clutter, there is also mental clutter and closely related the emotional clutter. And mental and emotional clutter is so connected because what we think determines how we feel. This is important. Many people may not notice that or maybe just say, oh, yeah, and move on. But really, let this sink in. Mental and emotional clutter is connected because what we think determines how we feel. For example, maybe your goal is to declutter your living room or your office, but so far you haven't done a single decluttering session, not even a 5 to 10 minute one that I suggest and that I even guide you through, that I talk about all the time. So what happened? Well, most likely some thoughts kept you from doing what you had planned to do, and those thoughts made you not being motivated, made you feel bad about yourself, and they did hold you back. So the problem was that the thoughts around what you wanted to do were negative, so then it made you feel not optimal or not motivated or not wanting to do it, right? And so then, because of your negative mind, you didn't hold yourself accountable, which often happens when we have a lot of mental clutter. We don't hold ourselves accountable to what we said we wanted to do, especially if it's just an agreement between ourselves, right? And not like most people hold themselves really good accountable towards other people, but not so much towards themselves. And that ends up then that we don't do what we said we are going to do. And what the solution here is like to ask why. What was I thinking? And holding ourselves accountable requires really an internal conversation with ourselves. Again, asking why. What was I thinking? Why was I thinking this? Is this really what I want to think? And then also, how does it make me feel? More about that later. I will go much deeper. What I want to say before that is that you probably will not hold yourself accountable if the discussion in your head with yourself, like I always say, like with the gremlin or the bully in our head, if that discussion, that internal conversation has components of beating yourself up included. And when we're beating ourselves up, with when our mental bully, when our gremlin beats ourselves up, right? Because we have to remember, we are not our thoughts. Our thoughts just happen there if we're not careful. So if that inner conversation has a beating ourselves up component, then that makes us feel rotten. That creates a lot of emotional clutter, oftentimes emotional clutter that is really unnecessary. And so then, of course, we're not really going to do what we said we're going to do, because it starts with the thought, but if the thought is negative, the feeling makes us feel negative feelings, then we're probably not taking the actions we intended to take. We may take no actions, or not doing anything is actually also an action. It's the inaction, right? Or then you do something like distracting yourself and suppressing your emotions and all that unhelpful stuff that makes you even feel worse and gets you not to do anything even more. And I often say to my coaching clients, the voice between our ears is not our friend. Oftentimes it's not. If we're not examining it, then it's really not. We do have a friend inside there, but the friend is much more quiet. The bully is the one that yells at you. And so we're often our worst enemy and say things to ourselves that we would never dare to say to anyone else. Now again, it's not us saying these things to ourselves. It's kind of like just these thoughts that show up. We're conditioned, most likely from society, from our upbringing, to say these things. I often say, like, who said that first to you? And then you just took it over, and now the bully throws this in front of your feet every day. But have you maybe noticed that no beating up of yourself actually helps? No screaming of the bully really helps you get into action. It may work short term, right? Like you might be able to push yourself short term, but it's never a long-term solution at all. And also, it's anything but kind. And not really self-loving either. And like I always say, like decluttering is self-love. That's where it comes from. It's mainly decluttering our brain, right? That's how we're more self-loving. We would never say all these things that we say to ourselves to anybody on the outside. Like, unless we're really, really angry, and then we probably regret it. But do you really regret what you say to yourself? Most of us, we don't even notice, or we don't even give the same grace to ourselves that we would give to others. So this is a little explanation how the mental clutter is creating the emotional clutter, and why a clutter-free or tidy or neat home doesn't necessarily mean that you have a clutter-free inside or a calm, peaceful inside, right? But now also, of course, if we have so much mental and emotional clutter, there is no wonder we don't want to look at our habits and patterns around the clutter that actually creates the outside clutter. And we also don't really want to do something about it because we're just worried that the bully is going to beat us up even more. And again, beating ourselves up makes us feel bad. And we often rather stick our head in the sand and distract ourselves with scrolling on social media, for example, or watching endless shows on Netflix, or whatever your way of escape is. Like for me, if I'm not careful, I just start reading books and I dive into that world. I read a lot of non-fictional books. I really hardly ever read fictional books, but still I just go into that world and think how great it would be if I would do all these things while at the same time not doing anything. So we really need to be intentional and doing the inner work, right? So next time you're setting like a decluttering goal, or any goal for that matter, and then you realize that you don't follow through with it, that you have all the excuses why you're not doing it, pay attention to your thoughts, the inner conversation that you're having with yourself around this goal, and notice then how these thoughts make you feel. Because again, how we feel determines how we act and what we do. And if you feel bad because of thoughts that discourage you from decluttering for even a few minutes, then you will most likely not do it ever, not even in the future, that we always think like, oh, I do it tomorrow, I do it next week, I do it when I have more time, I do it when I'm more motivated. That time will never come because your brain, your inner bully, will always be there discouraging you. And the only way out is you become aware of what's happening in your brain and you're consciously taking charge. So I'm known to say that all clutter starts in our mind. But now, of course, like I talked for 14 minutes already around mental and emotional clutter. But how actually do we declutter the mind? Well, let's discover that. But first, I want to real quick take a love tour. You know me. I always want to focus on the positive first. So a love tour of our mind is, let's appreciate that we actually have a mind, that we have a brain, that we can think, that we can make logical conclusions, that we can observe our behavior, that we can observe our inner dialogue and do something about it. Let's be really grateful that we can think, like that we can use our brain and use our mind, that we also can absorb new ideas and process information like you do just now listening to my podcast, that our beautiful brain and our beautiful mind is actually able to solve problems. It brought us where we are in today's society with all the inventions, and we're not living in caves anymore, and we're having computers, and we're having smartphones in our pockets. We can listen to podcasts whenever we want to, right? That's all based on the amazing brain and mind of some people. And lastly, let's be grateful that we can examine beliefs and create new beliefs, that we can form new beliefs, even though it's hard, but we can do it. And it's always important to be grateful for our mind, because sometimes we really don't like our mind that much. Or is that just me? I sometimes really don't like my mind, and I find it hard to constantly have to discover and explore what it's thinking now again, and how it's sabotaging me and what I want to do. But when we notice that we're sabotaging ourselves, then it's most likely because the mind is cluttered, and we need to learn to declutter it and manage it. And it's easier said than done again. And it's also, like I talked about in episode 260, it's a journey, not an event, right? Just saying, it's a journey, not an event. It's probably not going to happen overnight either for you that you notice a difference. We need to keep at it. Okay, now let's start decluttering the brain a bit. So when we slow down, this can show us that we may not live how we really want to live. It may show us what is really important to us, and it may make us realize that we don't living the life according to what is really important to us, or according to our own priorities. Because we are often just on autopilot. And autopilot means we're run by a lot of negative thoughts. I think I read or heard that first of all, our mind is trained or even calibrated on negative thoughts, because that's how we survived. We see danger everywhere, and we're easily anxious. That's how we survived as a species, yes? And then the other study says that we repeat about 95 or was it 98% of our thoughts every single day, again and then again and again. It's like regurgitated thoughts from the day before and the day before and the day before. So no matter, it's a little messy inside of our head. But if we practice more awareness, that I want to encourage you to do, and if we pay attention to our thoughts and to the self-talk, we can become aware of all this chatter, right? And the first step is kind of like just start noticing, are my thoughts mainly positive or negative? What is the ratio? Like I said, experts, whoever they are, say that our brain is trained to serve up negative thoughts. So just tune in and listen. Are my thoughts mainly positive or negative? And we can do this also in 3 easy steps. So I'll give you a quick overview. So step 1 is you do a thought download, and I will explain in a minute what that is. And then step 2 is you check in how these thoughts make you feel. Like I said, the mental clutter creates the emotional clutter, right? And then step 3 is you examine what you do when you think that thought and when you feel the way you feel thinking that thought. So let's look at this process a little bit closer. So step 1 was doing a thought download. And that's just like when we are decluttering physical items, where we take each item and we decide whether we want to keep this item or letting it go because it doesn't serve us anymore, or we don't use it anymore, and we don't like it anymore. We can do the same with thoughts. And the best way I do know how to do this is to do a thought download. And a thought download is just writing everything down that you're thinking. And you can even start with, I don't know what to write down. I don't know what I'm thinking, but just keep writing. Don't stop. Just set a timer for 5 minutes and start writing. And the thoughts will come eventually. So there is several people that I learned this from. First and foremost, I learned it from my mentor and coach, Brooke Castillo, from the Life Coach School. Also, Julia Cameron from the morning pages, she talks about this, that you're just writing down what you're thinking. Get everything out of your head as much as you can. Like I said, I like to set a timer for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. Set a timer and just start writing and don't stop writing. You can do that in a journal or on scrap paper. I often do it digitally in Evernote. I use Evernote as my note-taking app. I do it digitally because I can type much quicker than I can handwrite. But people say it is more helpful if you handwrite it because of the act of the thought going through your body into your hand onto the paper. Do what serves you. I think more important is that you actually do write it down at least once a day. And then that's also how you can look, what is the ratio between the good thoughts and the bad thoughts? And you might be surprised too what your brain thinks without you noticing because you're so on autopilot. Oh yeah, and don't hold back, I want to say too, because don't worry, you don't have to show this thought download to anyone. Rather, don't hold back. Just let everything come out and you can burn it or put it through the shredder or whatever you want to do with it after. The benefit you will get from pulling this all out of your brain is immense. So again, you can do this relatively quickly, just like my motto is, a few minutes a day keeps the chaos away. So it also keeps the mental chaos away. So just set a timer for 5 minutes and do it. Okay, and then the second step I said was you check in how these thoughts make you feel. And the issue with thoughts that don't serve us is that these thoughts create negative feelings, right? So negative thoughts usually create negative feelings. And the reason why this is relevant is because feelings actually determine what actions we're taking as a result. Byron Katie, by the way, has a similar process, and she talks about this too. In her work, she encourages us to ask, is the thought true? And also another question is, how does this thought make me feel? And that's exactly it, because how we feel determines what we do. And you can have all the intentions in the world of wanting to declutter and getting organized. If your thoughts are negative about that goal or about that task, you will not feel good. And when you don't feel good, you most likely will not do what you set out to do. And then now step 3 is that we want to examine what we do or don't do when we think these thoughts. So you could just probably pick one thought and see how it makes you feel, and then examine what you do or don't do when you think that thought. Oftentimes what we do if a negative thought triggers a negative emotion is we're trying to hide, we're trying to suppress that the emotion, or we try to buffer it or escape it, right? And that's why so many people scroll on social media or they watch Netflix, because we want to escape the negative feeling, because we're also not trained or not taught how to experience a negative feeling without the gremlin in our brain already yelling at us again that we shouldn't feel that way, and we should feel better, and we should think better, and we should be better, and we should do better. And all this shoulding doesn't really do any good. And we're just escaping more and more. And then maybe we start eating, or some people go online shopping to escape that feeling. And so notice, what do you do? Or what don't you do when you think the thought that you singled out, or when you think these thoughts that you have on your list? And now what you can do is, it's almost like step 4, but I feel like it's still step 3, because when we examine what we don't do or what we do, when we think a certain thought, then we can also come up with a thought that might be more helpful, more supportive to think, that then actually gets us to do what we want to do. We can also come up with a with a saying that I will do what I set out to do no matter what my gremlin says in my mind, no matter what or how rotten I feel, I will still do what I set out to do. Maybe also, like, again, give yourself permission to just start doing it for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Oftentimes, when we just start doing something, we will continue on, because starting is the hardest part, especially because of our negative and our negative thinking, stinking thinking, of our mental clutter and our emotional clutter. But awareness is really the first step to declutter these limiting beliefs and negative thoughts that don't serve us, and come up with something that actually serves us better. We are free to think what we want to think, but we need to be aware and more deliberate. And so before we end here, the bonus tip would be, it's just like with decluttering physical items or paper, a great step is to limit the amount of stuff that comes into our life. And with thoughts, that would be examine how much information do you actually consume on a daily basis that create possibly the negative thinking, and then actively reducing that intake as well. It's almost like burning the candle from both ends, right? Like, don't let so much negative information into your brain while you're actively replacing some of the negative thoughts that your gremlin presents to yourself with more supportive thoughts, right? Like, that's the goal here, because the more supportive thoughts you have, the more positive emotions you have, and the more likely you're going to do what you said you're going to do. And the good news is really that the work you do by clearing your internal mental and emotional clutter will have a positive effect on your outer world, on your outer environment, on your surroundings, on your home and your office, and vice versa. Yes, it works both ways, but it does also need both examinations and the work on both ends. It's like a coin. Like I said, it has two sides. It has the internal side and the outside side. Why can't I say this properly? So I come to a close now. That's it for today's myth busting. So the clutter-free home doesn't equal automatically a clutter-free mind. More so maybe the other way around. It both plays together, right? And so if this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. My handle is I am Conny Graf on Instagram. You can also just email me or leave a comment on any of my posts and say, I listened to this episode and it really resonated. But most of all, I want to encourage you to make sure to not just listen to this podcast and to what I'm saying, but also putting into action what you hear me say, what you hear me talking about, because only with actions we're actually making progress in our life. All the thinking is great. I love thinking and I love exploring. I love learning. I love listening to podcasts, but only actions will take you forward. And as always, just take on what's manageable for you. A few minutes a day keeps the chaos away. And I do try to offer simple steps and suggestions to do this work in just a few minutes a day, right? You could also enlist some support, right? Like you could have a family member or a trusted friend that holds you accountable, that you can bounce off your negative thoughts or your negative feelings, maybe in a text chat or by checking in with each other once a day or several times a week. Or you could hire a coach that holds you accountable and is a helpful sounding board. And if you're, for example, interested in working with me as your guide on both your physical and mental clutter, you can book a free Chaos to Peace consultation. In the show notes, there will be a link. And we will see whether working together makes sense and if we would be a good fit. And this is a no pressure chit chat. We're just exploring whether we would be a good fit. So that's it for this week. See you next time for another decluttering myth that I'm gonna bust. Until then, thank you for joining me today and listening all the way to the end. Have a beautiful and amazing week. And please subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes. See you next time. Take good care and be safe.